I love it when a book comes into my life at just the right time. It seems like that happens. The more I read, the more I find that there are just these things that just seem to happen. It's like, this is exactly what I need to hear right now. And that just happened with this book. My husband actually is the one who checked it out of the library, and I saw it and I thought, hey, I would like to read Cal Newport. I have, heard of him. I've listened to various podcast interviews that he's done. I also have listened to his podcast, but I've never actually read any of his books. They've been on my to-read list, but I've just not, come to them yet. And once I picked it up, I couldn't put it down. I ended up reading it in just a few days. If I had had more time to just devote to it, I could have read it all probably just in one day, maybe just in one sitting, if I had had a cup of coffee with me. It's a great book. I love the title, Slow Productivity, because it feels like those two things conflict. Like if you want to be productive, you have to go fast. And this book does a great job of kind of taking that apart and convinces you, I think by the end of it, that yeah, it's actually a good idea for us all collectively to kind of slow down and redefine productivity so that it's more attainable and we don't get burnt out. Now, first of all, Cal Newport, he's a smart guy. He got his PhD from MIT, and he is a professor of computer science at Georgetown University. He's also a writer for The New Yorker. I mean, he's got an impressive background, but I loved everything he had to say in this book. Basically, it was just really well written, but in a digestible kind of format, very actionable. So basically, he kind of wants to redefine productivity when it comes to knowledge workers. Now, knowledge workers meaning basically anyone who has some sort of level of autonomy in their work. This would not include things like cashiers at a fast food restaurant, because that really is more of a look, you've got a certain number of people to get through the line, and you stand there and you get paid for doing that specific job. But for a lot of people, their jobs are just more nebulous now. We have a lot of different responsibilities, and especially if you're, an entrepreneur, self-employed, if you have the ability to kind of pick and choose what you do, it can just be overwhelming, and it can feel like you just have to keep busy doing all these things, and all that busyness can definitely lead to burnout and to being not very effective overall. He breaks down slow productivity into 3 different principles. Number 1, do fewer things. Number 2, work at a natural pace. And number 3, obsess over quality. So the first one, do fewer things, is probably the most challenging one for me. And I think this is where a lot of knowledge workers actually will struggle with this book, because if you are a creative person, if you're entrepreneurial, you have a lot of ideas. And when you have a lot of ideas, there are a lot of things to act on. Like, for example, I am an independent author, so that means that I am editing my books, I'm writing my books. I also need to read a lot in order to be a better writer. I also need to be able to market my books. So the basic way I market is by having my YouTube channels. Well, in order to have my YouTube channels, I also need to make these videos. I need to record them, edit them, and upload them, and then also, try to announce those various places. I have a newsletter, I have 2 newsletters, one for my other website, 6 Miles to Supper, and I have this channel also, and I do a newsletter for it. But there's a lot of other types of tasks that can easily come in and just eat up your day. Things like emails and answering comments, and it's hard to know what are the things that you should do and what are the things that you can safely not do. For myself, one thing I stopped doing years ago was responding to YouTube comments on my other channel, simply because it got to the point where it was making it difficult to actually do the work, because some of the comments were just nasty and negative, and it was difficult to just not think about those things. But at the same time, it increased some anxiety, because it's like, oh, if I'm not responding to comments, is that going to end up hurting my views, and will that end up meaning that I won't be making the money from the channel that I need to make? So there is this real back and forth, I think, in a lot of creatives' minds about how do we balance that? How do we really do fewer things without negatively impacting our income? And he does give some practical advice. I mean, one thing that he says is perhaps deal with less income, which is, that is an option. He also talks about spending money on those things that you really do need to spend money on so that you can be more effective. And, that might be things like software. It might be things like hiring various people for different jobs that you would be better off not doing, which that's one thing that I have a hard time with because I'm a bit of a control freak. So, but again, good things to hear. So the second principle is to work at a human pace. And this is another difficult one for me, and I think for most people, because we do have that, hustle culture mentality. We want to work harder and harder and harder. And I do think it's good to push yourself. But I also understand that it is very difficult to keep up a sustained pace. Like if you feel like you're just going as hard as you can go over, weeks and weeks and weeks of time, and that it's never enough, that can easily lead to burnout. I've experienced burnout before. It is not fun, and it's not good for your overall productivity, because if you burn out and then you don't produce for a while, I mean, your earnings can go just down the toilet, and that's not good. And it can make it really hard to get yourself motivated to get back up and try again. So working at a more human pace is important, and he gave some good practical advice on how to do that. How to have boundaries, things like scheduling meetings or not scheduling meetings on certain days of the week, by just scheduling in some slower seasons, and he does a great job of pointing out you don't even have to tell people. Like if you're in a more supervised kind of position, like you actually do have a boss to answer to, you don't have to say these things out loud. It's kind of the idea of quiet quitting, which he does a great job, I think, of being really balanced in how he presents quiet quitting. Quiet quitting, if you don't know, is this idea that people were just not really doing the maximum for their job that they could, and not really saying that they weren't, but just kind of just doing it, or not doing the things that they would have otherwise done. And there was, and I think he did a good job of explaining, here's where that's coming from, here's maybe why it's not great, and here's maybe a compromise that we could do that will solve the problem. Now, this, again, I think is difficult for knowledge workers. For me personally, as somebody who's on YouTube and who writes, my brain is constantly thinking of ideas. I mean, I'm constantly writing in my head. It doesn't really matter if it's fiction or nonfiction. I'm constantly writing, and I'm always thinking of new video ideas. And so it's difficult to turn off your brain. Like, I don't even think you can turn off your brain. The best thing I've found is just to kind of jot stuff down and try to get it out of my head so that it's not trying to just hold itself in there. But it is a difficult thing to figure out. And plus, especially for creatives, there's a lot of uncertainty around, like when you are creating a thing, like maybe the first book sold really well, maybe the next one doesn't sell so well. So then you think, well, is it that, I wrote the wrong thing, or was it just the wrong time? There can be so much uncertainty that it feels like, well, I got to keep, doing more and more and more, and I can work harder and harder and harder. And I can definitely see how there's that temptation there, but I can also see how it can end up backfiring on you, because if you're constantly feeling stressed and overworked, it's just harder to be creative. That is one thing I've learned about writers, is that generally speaking, they write, for maybe a few hours a day, and that's it. And they generally nap at some point during the day too. But it can be hard to let yourself do that, because there is that idea like, no, I got to be working hard all the time. Which leads us to the last principle, which is to obsess obsess over quality. Now, this one really resonated with me because I do this. And I mean, maybe you might think, well, gosh, your videos aren't that great, but they're as best as I can make them. And I do obsess over the quality of everything I do. And I have found that can be difficult to walk that line. And he absolutely says, this is something we kind of have to be careful about, because perfectionism can actually lead to no produced work. Like if you get stuck, if you say like, I cannot release this book until it's absolutely perfect, well, guess what? You can always make it a little bit better. So you'll never ship things if you have that perfectionist mindset. So you kind of have to walk this line, and he gives some really good advice about how to do that, how to maybe bring in people so that they're expecting the work to be done, like you share with your audience, you're working on this certain thing that puts enough pressure to get you over the finish line, but not so much pressure that you can't just really do a great job on it. And, he also points out how when you do that, you will just automatically increase the quality of your work because people know it's coming. So there's that expectation there. So overall, I highly recommend this book. I'm going to own it. I think, after reading this book, I really just want to buy all of his books and just keep them on my bookshelf and reread them to remind myself not to burn out and to do things at a slower pace. So if you've read any of Cal Newport's books, or if you listen to his podcast and you have found something interesting that he has said, please be sure to leave it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. Allie McGee comes home from school one day to find that her little brother Pete is gone. She remembers the imaginative stories he told about a magical tree in the forsaken forest, and she immediately sets out into the woods behind her house to find him. She begins to realize his stories were true when she finds the enchanted tree and is transported to a different world, only to discover that Pete's been kidnapped by the wicked King Olshek. She must go on a dangerous journey to the land of Hinnom to get to the castle where her brother is being held captive. Will Allie be able to save her brother? Or will she too be taken prisoner in Olshek's castle?